Thank you for the update, Professor Arian. I'll have to speak with Headmistress Arvanduz myself, won't I? That would be for the best, Professor Wayland. But tread carefully, my friend, this situation is highly unusual. Roland sighed, glancing at the monitor where Arian's concerned face hovered. He had just received word that the Xandar Institute leader wanted to chat with him. She hadn't given a deadline, but it was implied that if he didn't show up at her office, Bernier wouldn't be returning to Albrook. He hadn't anticipated this development when he formulated his plan, as the woman had always remained passive regarding his decisions. It seemed he had pushed his luck too far with his last adventure. But it also raised the question, why hadn't she contacted him directly earlier? Could there be a limit to her abilities? He recalled the one time she had intervened in his affairs. Yavanna had protected him from the other Tier 4 class holder in the nearby dungeon. Considering that, the Devere estate might have been simply too far away for her plant-based magic to reach. Perhaps she could only influence a limited area around where she resided, likely connected to her mage tower, which resembled a giant tree. He had examined it before and concluded that the roots extended in all directions, spreading far beyond the Institute's premises. Perhaps this was her territory, and it had boundaries. It was similar to his situation in Albrook, where he had been spreading runic cabling. In theory, just like modern technology, there would be no limit to how far these cables could extend, and as long as they existed, they would be under his direct control. However, this could not happen in the near future, as it would require a colossal investment of both time and resources, neither of which he currently possessed. If his theory was correct, then he was safe here in Albrook from the woman's influence. Even a Tier 4 class holder had their limits. I see. I need to take care of a few things here first. Could you keep an eye on Bernier for me, until then? Of course, my friend. Don't worry, I'll arrange a temporary badge for him and some lodgings, he'll be safe here. Thank you. No problem. You've already opened my eyes to the possibilities of runes, my friend. This is nothing compared to what you've done for me. Arian chuckled as he replied. He had been nothing but cheerful since Roland arrived at his doorstep. Thanks to Roland's influence, Arian had been exposed to innovations like the runic power armor and new ways to make his lectures more engaging for the young mages. Roland exhaled deeply as he ended the conversation with Arian. Despite the reassurances, the weight of the unknown still pressed heavily on him. His assistant, Bernier, being detained at the Institute by Headmistress Arvanduz was not something he could dismiss lightly. He had expected some consequences after the incident at the Devere estate, but this was an unforeseen complication. After everything that had transpired, Roland had hoped for some time to regroup, focus on his projects, and help his brother and Lucille adjust to their new lives. But now, the headmistress had other plans. If she wanted an explanation, she would get one, but Roland knew he had to tread carefully. She was connected to his father, and returning to the Institute might result in him being captured or even held hostage. Despite his recent advancements in his inventions, there was no way he could take on a Tier 4 class holder in combat. There's no way I'll be able to escape that tower once I'm inside. Should I just take Bernier and flee? He started weighing his options. One plan involved going to the Institute, retrieving Bernier, and making a quick escape. While Roland considered himself a competent fighter, the Institute housed far more mages than the small tower he had previously broken into. Taking control of the teleportation gate this time would be far more difficult. Fleeing with his glider was another possibility, but even if he managed to slip past the barrier, Yavanna's influence likely stretched far, perhaps reaching towns days away. The other mages were capable of flight as well, it was only a matter of time before he'd be chased down and caught. The whole situation seemed impossible. But then again, the headmistress had been lenient with him before, perhaps he was simply overthinking it. Roland's mind raced through possibilities, each more dangerous than the last. He couldn't afford to wait too long, Bernier's life could be in jeopardy. He had undoubtedly offended some mages within the Institute, and once they discovered who Bernier was, they might seek revenge through him. And, of course, the headmistress wouldn't wait forever for a response. However, his thoughts were abruptly interrupted by the warm nudge of a nose at the back of his head. Worf. Ah. I'm fine, don't worry about me. It was Agni, his wolf companion, whom he hadn't seen in a while. Agni rested his muzzle on Roland's shoulder, whimpering softly. Roland couldn't help but reach up to pet him on the head, realizing his loyal wolf was simply trying to cheer him up. Despite the bind he was in, there was no use worrying about it now. All he could do was plan carefully and hope for the best, as he always did. Thanks, Agni. Let's head up, I do need some rest to clear my mind. Before turning to leave, Roland called out to Sebastian, his AI. His creation had been steadily evolving, becoming something more sophisticated. Its speech patterns had been upgraded to accept more complex commands, but Roland still needed time to fully analyze this latest iteration. The artificial spirit had developed a degree of autonomy, and Roland needed to ensure he could properly control it before releasing it into the runic network. Coming from a world that feared rogue ace running amok, he wanted to proceed cautiously. Sebastian, notify me if Arian tries to contact me, and keep watch over the city. Follow the procedures I've outlined for you and notify me immediately if you detect any anomalies. Yes, Master. Sebastian replied using a cold text-to-speech-like voice that he intended to fix later. The glowing orb of light hovered close for a moment before drifting off to another part of the workshop. Despite the appearance, Sebastian's true form was the deeper within the workshop, and this was nothing more than a form that was easier to converse with. He fashioned him in such a way so that people like Bernier and Elydia would be able to converse with the runic computer whenever they wished. Agni padded beside Roland, but it proved a problem to get him into the elevator again. His size had already become a problem, and perhaps he could use some of his spatial runes to alleviate the problem. Within the institute, there were many rooms affected by dimensional magic. Even the main institute was under such a spell, creating a vast larger interior than the exterior of the building. He could probably do the same with the elevator here, which would save up a lot of money as he wouldn't need to renovate. First, I'll have to get Bernier back. Now get in there, Agni, we need to go up. Woof. Roland pushed his overgrown wolf into the elevator and opted to take the emergency stairs instead. It was a hassle, especially since he was already tired, but he was larger than his wife and would have trouble fitting in the elevator with Agni. While going up, his mind raced with probabilities for the future. When he reached the top floor, he exited through the secondary workshop, which belonged to his assistant. Diana must be home, he muttered, noticing the absence of Bernier's wife. He had intended to mention why Bernier wasn't around, but neither she nor their child was there. The couple often brought their son to the workshop, and Roland recalled Bernier asking him to craft a special sound-blocking device. It was designed to block out the noise from the outside but allow sounds from inside to escape. They used it for the crib that Roland now looked at. The child could sleep peacefully, undisturbed by the clanging and hammering of the workshop. However, if the baby started crying, the device would ensure the parents were instantly alerted. Roland had even designed a small bracelet to fit around the child's wrist, crafted from a special elastic metallic polymer alloy. It utilized a faint amount of mana to monitor the child's vital signs. If anything were to happen, the parents would be alerted, even if the sounds of the child's cries didn't reach them. The bracelet could also notify them if the child woke up, even if he didn't start calling out or crying. This technology was designed by him to monitor prisoners, but it worked fine with children as well. After looking around, he decided to leave and fetch Agni, who had gotten stuck again. After a few tugs, he managed to wrestle him free from the confines of the elevator. It had been bent in a few places but was still in working order. The sight of his windmills and home brought him some joy. He had been away for so long, and now, seeing the familiar windmills turning gently in the breeze above his house, the tension eased slightly. It reminded him of the good old days when it was just him, his wolf pup, and his starry-eyed assistant. Those were simpler times, which he occasionally longed for, though he wouldn't trade them for everything he had since accomplished. One of the biggest reasons he no longer dwelled on his past was the woman who opened the door to his home. There she was, his wife, waving him over in an awkward manner. She seemed troubled and in need of his help. He often found himself thinking about her while out on his adventures, something he wished to limit in the future, though he knew it would be difficult to follow through. One realization from his latest escapade was that he was still lacking. Tier 3 wasn't as powerful as he had once believed, and there was still another mountain to climb. Even then, he could never allow himself to relax, always striving for more. After safely bringing Bernier back from the institute, he needed to shift his focus. Though Arthur's power base was growing quickly, it still wasn't enough. Is something wrong? Yes, I think you'll have to carry them to their room. They're a lot more tired than I expected. Elydia replied, motioning toward Robert and Lucille, who were slumped on the couch, fast asleep. Lucille rested her head on Robert's shoulder, while Robert had his arm draped protectively around her. Their exhaustion was evident, and Roland couldn't help but smile slightly at the sight. I guess they really couldn't hold out any longer, he said quietly as he gently picked Lucille up. She shook slightly but didn't wake as he tried to move her. Robert remained sound asleep, but his body resisted when Roland tried to take his lover away. After some gentle effort to loosen his brother's grip, Roland managed to carry Lucille into the guest room. He laid her on the large bed, leaving it to Elydia to decide whether she needed to be changed into something more comfortable for sleep. Agni peeked through one of the windows to watch, but stayed quiet, sensing that the two needed rest. Fortunately, Robert had already removed most of the armor he'd been wearing, so only the chainmail needed to come off. Should I just leave him on the couch? What for? If these two have done half as much for each other as you've told me, they're practically husband and wife. They should get used to it, and when one of them wakes up, it'll probably be better to see a familiar face next to them, don't you think? Elydia replied while adjusting things in the guest room. After a brief pause, she told Roland it was fine to enter. He returned with Robert slung over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes. The way he carried his brother was a lot rougher, but he kept him steady while placing him down next to the already covered-up Lucille. Roland gently placed Robert next to Lucille on the bed, trying to ensure they would both be comfortable. Once they were settled, he stepped back and placed his hand over the two. He was still wearing his armor, which started gently glowing around the palm area. Soon an aura of gentle light surrounded the two sleeping people as a spell was cast. That spell is truly handy, that's much better. Elydia nodded in response as she could tell that the smell that was coming from Robert had been removed. He had been forced to hold on for a while and had worked up a considerable amount of grime during their journey. The spell had not only cleaned him up but also seemed to soothe both Robert and Lucille into deeper sleep, making them look much more peaceful. That should keep them comfortable for a while. They probably won't wake up until tomorrow morning, let's just leave them be. Elydia smiled softly and nodded. This was his home, so setting up a small barrier around the bed to block out outside noise was simple for him. Once everything was in place, he left the guest room and moved over to the same couch his brother had previously occupied. Now, he had some quiet time alone with his wife and Agni's antics in the background. Before they started talking, Roland tried to organize his thoughts. Armand and Lobelia were still out roaming the kingdom. He had instructed them to leave the Devere lands as quickly as possible, so they should be safe. There was a chance the Count might identify him as a suspect soon and target those connected to him. However, both Armand and Lobelia were powerful Tier 3 class holders, and there wasn't much known about them. If things became complicated, he could use the teleportation gate to assist them, something that didn't require the Institute's direct involvement, as he could simply port them to his own workshop. He had already acquired a list of towers throughout the kingdom from the Institute. Establishing a connection and contacting them through crystal balls was possible, it just came with a hefty fee. Albrook was becoming noticeably more peaceful. The increased presence of the church had begun attracting more people from outside the city. Some had even started venturing into the dungeon to join expeditions. Healers and paladins were rare in this world, and having them nearby significantly raised the survival chances of adventurers in the area. Even if someone got injured, as long as they retreated in time, there would likely be a priest somewhere in the dungeon to heal and save them. Arthur was steadily building his influence, with Roland leading the way. With Mary, Morian, and Gareth around, he was no longer needed as a bodyguard, freeing him to focus on expanding the runic cabling throughout the city. He was even extending it to the outskirts, installing rune lanterns beyond the city limits. The money was flowing in steadily, but he still needed more. His ultimate goal now was to introduce power armor technology to the city, a potential trump card for the future. Roland was also aware that his personal growth had stagnated. His level hadn't increased much recently, as he had been preoccupied with crafting Bernier's prosthesis and worrying about his brother and sister. What he really needed was to return to the dungeon and explore how deep it truly went. The underground remained largely uncharted, with seemingly endless crypts filled with undead. There was so much left to accomplish, but first, he needed to get his assistant back. A golden coin for your thoughts. Sorry, I've done it again. His thoughts were interrupted by Elydia calling out to him. She had 2 cups of tea in her hands, one of which she handed to Roland. He took it gratefully, letting the warm cup rest in his hands for a moment before taking a sip. The familiar, calming taste of chamomile mixed with a hint of honey helped ease the tension from his shoulders. You've been overthinking again, Elydia said with a knowing smile, sitting down beside him. You always get this distant look when your mind is racing ahead of itself. Roland sighed and nodded. I suppose I have been, but the situation with Bernier requires my attention. Elydia placed her hand gently on his arm, her gaze soft but carrying a hint of annoyance. I know, but you can't handle everything alone. You've done more than enough already. Bernier will be fine for a little while longer. Roland smirked, amused by her calm certainty. Resting doesn't seem to come easy these days, I'm not sure if I should, While talking he suddenly felt a bout of drowsiness wash over him, something that he didn't expect to happen. He looked at the empty cup of tea in his hand and then back to Elydia. That's why I took matters into my own hands. Elydia replied with a slight grin. Roland raised an eyebrow at her response, but before he could ask what she meant, he felt a sudden wave of exhaustion hit him like a tidal force. Elydia, what did you? Just a little sleeping potion I got from Rastix, it was able to knock out Agni for a while day, so it should at least make you rest for a few hours, now don't resist it and just lie down on the couch. Roland's protest was short-lived as his body surrendered to the potion's effects. While there was a small window of opportunity to attempt to use a detoxifying spell with the help of his armor, he allowed himself to rest. He felt his muscles relax, his mind quieting, as he slipped into a deep, much-needed sleep. You always try to carry the world on your shoulders, Roland. But even you need to take a break now and then. She whispered, brushing a few strands of hair away from his forehead and letting him gently drift into well-deserved slumber. Where am I? I'm sure that I was. Roland clutched his head, struggling to piece together his scattered thoughts. His mind was a foggy mess, memories slipping through his fingers. The last thing he remembered was drinking tea that his wife had given him. Then he'd woken up here, lying on a wooden floor, in a strange, unfamiliar place. The room felt oddly surreal, like something from the magical institute where bookshelves floated mid-air. As Roland took in his surroundings, a disorienting sense of familiarity washed over him. The architecture around him looked bizarre, a warped imitation of a place he knew well. The walls bent at unnatural angles, and furniture floated lazily around the room, as if gravity had taken a vacation. He took a tentative step, only to realize he was standing on the ceiling, and yet he didn't fall. Is this, the Arden estate? He murmured with a confused tone filling his voice. It looked like his family's estate, but everything felt distorted, as though the estate were trying to remember itself and failing. The tapestries were worn but still beautiful, their scenes shifting and changing subtly whenever he looked away. Roland tried to ground himself, tracing his way down a corridor, which stretched and wobbled like a reflection on water. A faint, elusive memory stirred at the back of his mind, the mostly abandoned wing of the estate, his childhood sanctuary, and the library there that he used to attend. He moved as the world distorted around him, but with each step, the scenery became more grounded. The memories started coming back, and with them the mansion started to solidify more. Finally, he stood before a door he hadn't seen in years, the one that he arrived into this world, the original Roland's room. After taking a deep breath, he reached out and turned the handle. The door swung open with an almost silent creak, revealing his childhood room just as he remembered it, or close enough. The bed was small, covered in a faded quilt he recognized as his maid's handiwork. Most of the rest was empty space, no toys or paintings, just a bed with an addition that he did not expect to see. There was a figure on the bed, a child whose face he couldn't truly see. The child was probably around the same age Roland had been when he first arrived in this world, about 5. The boy didn't look at him, instead was staring out the window at a view hidden from Roland's sight. Eventually, though, the child sensed someone else in the room and glanced over his shoulder. His features were coming into focus, though a haze still blurred Roland's vision. You shouldn't be here, the boy said, his voice small yet steady. Roland's heart skipped a beat. He recognized that voice as it belonged to him when he was a child in this world. He tried to speak, to ask the child who he was, but his lips refused to part. Instead, he felt drawn forward, each step slow and heavy, like walking through mud. With every step, it became harder to move, but the boy continued speaking. You shouldn't be here, if you stay, it will notice you. Roland froze mid-step, or perhaps he simply couldn't move any farther. At the boy's words, a deep rumble began to shake the entire estate. The window, once obscured by mist, started to clear, revealing something lurking beyond. Through the haze, he could finally make it out, an enormous, monstrous eyeball, eerily familiar, like something from a forgotten nightmare. It seemingly floated in some kind of empty void, massive tentacles protruding from it with many smaller eyeballs everywhere. Each tentacle wove through the air like it was breathing, its smaller eyes blinking in erratic patterns as they were looking for something. Roland couldn't place where he'd seen this creature before, nor why it filled him with such dread. The boy on the bed remained still, his gaze locked on Roland. "You have to leave," the child said in a low, urgent whisper. "If it sees you, number $at." Suddenly, the boy's words turned into loud, distorted static, drowning out whatever he was trying to warn him about. The gigantic eyeball outside wasn't looking directly at them, but its massive, writhing tentacles were creeping toward the estate, slowly coiling around it. The walls started to constrict around them, bending and warping as if responding to the approach of the creature outside. Roland's pulse quickened as a claustrophobic feeling crept over him. It was as if the room itself was afraid, trying to protect itself. The child sat still on the bed, staring at him through a haze, his face unclear. For a brief moment, it seemed as if he was smiling, a soft, soothing expression that puzzled Roland greatly. Then, suddenly, a radiant light erupted from the boy, flooding the entire estate in white. The monstrous entity outside let out a deafening roar, its tentacles recoiling as they were engulfed in the warm, pulsating glow. Roland could feel the light's strange warmth wash over him, both fierce and comforting, as if it was warding off the darkness inching closer. The searing light grew brighter, pulling Roland further from the strange room and the monstrous figure outside, until everything around him melted into a surreal blur. He felt himself slipping back, a gentle tug as if something was guiding him away. Then, the light receded, and when Roland opened his eyes, he found himself lying on his own couch, staring up at the familiar ceiling of his home. The lingering warmth from the dream filled him with confusion. His heart pounded as the memory of that enormous eye, a sinister presence filled his memories, but soon the thoughts faded and he found his mind at peace. What was that? I'm sure, I've seen that eyeball before, everything felt so real. He mumbled to himself as he tried to recall the strange dream he'd just had. The enormous eyeball and the child's words echoed faintly in his mind, leaving him unsettled. He sat up slowly, rubbing his temples as if to chase away the last wisps of the dream. The feeling of the boy's presence and that protective light lingered, blending with the quiet of his home. He glanced around, half expecting the walls to waver or the couch to sink into some other dimension, but everything remained solid. I'm not in an illusion, at least. After activating his debugging skill and scanning his surroundings, he was certain he wasn't trapped in any abyssal cult illusion. The dream felt too vivid, and he wondered if there was more to it than met the eye. It was simply too surreal to dismiss as an ordinary dream. This world was built on powerful magic, inhabited by strange entities and forces. His instincts told him it might be unwise to ignore the dream, but at the moment, he had other concerns demanding his attention. Name: Roland Arden, L198. Classes: T3 Runesmith Overlord, L23 Primary. T2 Runesmith Lord, L50 Tertiary. T2 Runic Engineer, L50 Secondary. T1 Mage, L25X. T1 Runic Monoscribe, L25X. T1 Runic Blacksmith, L25X. My level hasn't gone up in a while, has it? Roland sighed as he looked at his status screen. His progress had stagnated, and seeing it laid out in such detail only reminded him of the mountain of work ahead. The eerie dream he'd just experienced left a faint echo in his mind, but practical matters pulled him back to reality. The fleeting memory of the child's warning and the monstrous eyeball wouldn't fade, though. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he felt he'd encountered that entity before. It was somewhat similar to the monster that was responsible for Bernier losing his arm, so perhaps it was just a nightmare from feeling guilty over it. He shook his head and focused instead on his surroundings, the quiet home or Agni's muffled snores just outside his home's main door through which he could not fit in anymore. A note on the counter caught his eye. He recognized Elidia's handwriting immediately. Asterisk, there's some food in the runic refrigerator. Don't let Agni eat it, he has already been fed and has been getting fatter since you've been so busy. I'll be with the other children and return after nightfall. Asterisk. Roland chuckled, imagining his overgrown wolf poking his head through the kitchen window, sniffing hopefully at the fridge, and getting some treats from a disgruntled Elidia. Agni, unfortunately, had outgrown the house a while back. He usually stayed in his stable-sized doghouse, but it seemed that he preferred to stay closer to his master, even if that meant blocking the way in. He decided he'd let Agni continue his self-appointed role of guard dog for now, as he needed a moment to gather his thoughts. A clock directly in front of him indicated it was close to 7 in the evening. Judging by the note, his wife would probably return in an hour or two. The dormitory he had built for all the orphans wasn't far, so he wasn't too concerned about her safety. Robert and Lucille were still fast asleep, as they hadn't gotten a sleep resistance skill as he had. Even though he'd been drugged by a potent sleeping agent, it had only lasted for about 10 hours. He'd have to talk to his wife about it once she returned, but he understood her reasoning. He'd been stuck at the institute for a long time, and when he finally returned, he was either leaving again or absorbed in crafting Bernier's runic prosthesis. It was clear she was worried about him overextending himself. Still, he knew that true rest wasn't an option yet. His recent adventures had shown him that he was far from strong or independent enough to feel secure. Will I have to reach Tier 4 before I can ever relax? After sighing, he headed to the runic fridge, where he found some treats from his wife, a well-prepared meal with meat, roasted vegetables, and even garlic bread, one of his favorites. To no surprise, his armor was still mostly on him as he had only managed to remove his helmet. Somehow, Elydia had managed to get him onto the couch though, probably with the help of a levitation spell which was possible through some of the inventions in his home to which his wife had access to. Should I remove her runic privileges for that? He chuckled to himself as he stood, waving a hand to cast a spell of silence. His steps needed to be quiet so as not to disturb Agni and his brother, who were still slumbering. Soon, he was seated at the dining table, savoring his meal while contemplating his plans. His first priority was rescuing Bernier, but there was much more work ahead. For one, his level had been stagnant for some time, so he was planning a return to the dungeon. With the help of his various runic creations, he hoped to make quick progress through the undead temples. Roland was counting on encountering higher-level undead monsters there, which would let him grind for experience once more. His old method of using runic schematics had reached its limit, and he wasn't expecting to discover any Tier 4 runes anytime soon. To achieve that, he'd likely need to infiltrate the Dwarven Union's main facility, where the greatest craftsmen guarded their secrets. Next on his agenda was modernizing Albrook, perhaps by constructing a few larger facilities for assembly. Coming from a more advanced world, the idea of building factories for part production was natural to him. However, in this world, everything revolved around the class system. A seasoned, high-level blacksmith could do the work of 10 or 20 lesser blacksmiths alone. There was no real demand for factories, as levels and skills were what mattered most. But Roland's mindset and abilities differed. While factories in his old world required skilled workers, his vision here was different. He imagined a mechanized facility powered by runic technology, independent of class-based skills. Machines and runic cabling could operate tirelessly, assembling parts or even entire structures, bypassing the limitations of individual skill and enabling true mass production. This approach could create a steady supply of advanced items, potentially leveling the playing field for those without high-tier classes. One issue with the factory concept, however, lay in his incomplete understanding of rune crafting, the method of creating runes. For some reason, even if he meticulously carved out perfect rune paths manually, they wouldn't activate unless his skill was in use. He couldn't transfer his skill to automatons, and even his runic vision didn't provide any answers. Still, he had been working on a few theories and alternatives to make a runic factory viable. In theory, he should eventually be able to produce parts, but it would take time to make this vision a reality. Then all-around strengthening of Albrook was also in order, which included his brother. He was a well-trained knight with proper training and had served during battles in the north of the kingdom. He would be a fine addition to Arthur's troops. The other Valyrian sons were still out there, and with Albrook's lord gaining power, things would start to move. Roland could see him being invited to noble parties and perhaps them clashing with opposing troops. There were ways of taking over territory, and that town he rescued a few street urchins from seemed dissatisfied with their leadership. Fallout also awaited him from the headmistress, and potentially from his own father. Previously, he had thought Wentworth cared little for family, seeing them as nothing more than expendable pawns. However, Wentworth had struck deals with Count Graham de Vere and the Castellane house when Lucienne was involved. It was possible he would eventually come searching for Robert as well. Then there is also the church. This really blows. Agni was treated by them as a kind of holy beast, making it difficult to take him anywhere. Once Roland sorted his things out, he planned to bring Agni into the dungeon for some adventures, but with Solarian fanatics everywhere, that would likely be a challenge. With a sigh, Roland finished his meal, wiped his hands on a cloth, and glanced out the window. The night outside was quiet, but his ears picked up something, familiar footsteps and breathing. I guess Elydia came back early. It was his wife, trekking through the compound that had automatic lights to show the way and turrets to defend her from harm. Roland felt a sense of calm wash over him as he heard Elydia's footsteps approaching. It was reassuring to know that despite all the chaotic things demanding his attention, here, within his own home, there was peace, however temporary it might be. She did drug me with that potion. A grin appeared on his lips as he moved closer to the entrance. He made sure that no light would shine in the corner that he was standing in and then waited. Elydia approached from the front, but he knew that she wouldn't use that door as it had been blocked by a large wolf. Instead, she needed to circle around and use the back door instead where he was already waiting. Finally, the door creaked open, and Elydia slipped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. "Welcome back!" Roland shouted while jamming both his index fingers into Elydia's waist from the back. She was quite ticklish near her sides and would always flinch in a comedic fashion if he inserted both his fingers there at the same time. Ack! Elydia leapt forward, nearly dropping the bundle of books and papers she was holding as she spun around to face Roland. Her wide eyes softened the moment she saw him grinning mischievously in the shadows, and her glare turned into a bemused smile. "Roland!" she gasped, clutching her chest with one hand. "You scared the life out of me." He laughed, rubbing the back of his neck as he took a step back. "I couldn't resist. That's for giving me that special tea." Elydia rolled her eyes, shaking her head in annoyance, but under her pouty gaze a smile started to form. "It was for your own good. You needed rest more than anyone I know, and I'd do it again if it means you actually get some sleep." He raised a hand in mock surrender and then closed the door behind her. There were some things they needed to discuss, but perhaps that could wait. "Ah, I know, but next time, perhaps just ask." "As I that would ever work." They both knew how thick-headed Roland could be, and after a little pause, the couple found themselves in each other's embrace. While time here was fleeting and there was much more work to do, Roland savored this moment as tomorrow he needed to finalize his plans and decide how to tackle the Bernier issue. "The High Commander is approaching." Greeting the High Knight Commander. A large group of armored men performed the customary military salute of the kingdom, directed at a single individual wearing an intricate suit of runic armor. Though the armor was different from what they remembered, they recognized the Knight Commander, Commander Wayland. Forming a line on either side of him, they ensured he had an unobstructed path to the Valyrian villa, where their lord, Arthur Valyrian, resided. So much for a quiet morning. He was not alone, however, and the other soldiers quickly noticed that his entourage wore similarly styled clothing. First, they saw a man dressed in a full set of armor, similar to their leaders, though somewhat plainer. Beside him was a figure in a robe, their face hidden behind a mask. While the armored man was around the same size as the Knight Commander, the robed figure was smaller and thinner, leading many to assume they were likely female. The trio soon disappeared through the main door, and only then did the knights begin to murmur among themselves. "Those two looked important, who do you think that was? Maybe some new hires? One of them looked like a proper knight, maybe they are here to swear their loyalty to the Lord. Ha, this place is really growing." The men all began nodding, eager to cheer. Among them were failed adventurers, soldiers who hadn't quite made the cut in other cities, and others simply drawn by the high pay. Initially, they didn't know what to think of the late Valyrian's son. They assumed he would be incompetent, yet the city continued to prosper, along with their wages and equipment. They were now proud soldiers of the Valyrian household, and some even aspired to one day join the Duke's personal knights, a dream they now felt was within reach. Back in the estate, Roland sighed inwardly, walking through the estate clad in his rune Mark II armor, a cape flowing behind him. His older, bulkier armor had been melted down, making this his only remaining set. Fortunately, he had hidden it well under his robe during his adventures across the kingdom and was fairly certain that no one would connect this armored figure to Wayland, the deputy professor, at least not yet. Even if they did, as long as his identity as the man in the green goblin mask remained a mystery, he would be safe. To his right was Robert, wearing one of the armor suits from his store. His whole body was covered and the helmet was equipped with a voice changer. To his left was Lucille, soon to be Robert's wife. She was wearing a magical robe with runic capabilities, specially woven from super light metallic threads, a technology he had started using after his visit to the Institute. She also had a mask with eye cutouts and a small mouth opening covered by a darkened mesh. It would not allow any of her facial features to shine through in an attempt to keep her identity hidden from everyone. "Let them in." Roland arrived at the entrance to Arthur's office. In the past, the ones to welcome him would be both Gareth and Morian. Neither of them was here to greet him that day, as the two had advanced to Tier 3 classes and were busy training. Mary was constantly with Arthur along with a hidden entourage of assassins all wearing maid uniforms. Perhaps if he was an enemy, the two new knight commanders would have shown themselves, but Roland had already proven that he was a trustworthy ally. Arthur Valerian's office was richly furnished yet restrained, with polished wood and fine tapestries lining the walls, lending the room a warm elegance. Once filled solely with bookshelves, the office had been steadily upgraded, and there were even plans to add a new wing to the estate. Money was flowing in steadily, and their progress showed no signs of slowing. It was finally time to invest their well-earned funds. "Commander Wayland, your reports are usually less eventful, is what I want to say, but I'd be telling lies," Arthur remarked, his mouth twitching with amusement, though his gaze remained sharp. "Tell me, did it not occur to you to perhaps ask them before bringing them here under cover of night?" Roland sighed, removing his helmet and holding it at his hip. "To be fair, Arthur, I did ask them, and they agreed, at least one," he replied, shrugging slightly and glancing back at the two figures behind him. When the pair had awoken that morning, he'd briefed them on the situation in Albrook, assuring them that Arthur could be trusted to keep their secret. Now, he removed his helmet as a signal that it was safe for them to do the same, and they soon followed suit. "Oh, you two really do look alike, though there are a few differences, wouldn't you say, Mary?" "Yes, my lord, the resemblance is quite uncanny." Roland glanced at Robert, understanding immediately what they meant. Though they shared similar features, his older brother was more stout, with a pronounced square jaw, while Roland's own features were more balanced, with a scholarly quality. Strength was the first word that came to mind when looking at Robert, while Roland had a more even, balanced appearance with fewer flaws. "Now then, if I understand correctly, this is Robert Arden, your older brother, and this is Lady Lucille de Vere, quite the entourage." Arthur seemed slightly troubled, and Roland didn't expect him not to be. These weren't simple refugees that he brought along, and they were both children of nobles. They weren't really inferior to Arthur in status, as even though he was the son of a duke, he was still a bastard. Robert on the other hand was from a proper wife, and Lucille's father was a count. Arthur chuckled softly, shaking his head as he took in the unusual scene before him. Roland's brother, Robert, stood tall, his bearing marked by the disciplined rigidity of a seasoned knight. Lucille, on the other hand, moved gracefully, but her nervous glances around the office hinted at her discomfort in such unfamiliar surroundings. However, there was a lot of curiosity as well, and she kept looking at the many runic devices inside of his office. "My apologies for imposing on you, Lord Valerian," Robert eventually responded while also bowing forward, his armor producing a slight clinking sound. "Ha, I'm no Lord Valerian, at least no yet. There is no reason for titles if we are just among us. As you might have noticed, your younger brother just calls me by my name. I would appreciate it if you did the same, my friend." Surprise covered Robert's face as he glanced at Roland for confirmation. Roland just responded with a nod, as he had already contacted Arthur previously and had a chat with him about the issue even before his sibling woke up from sleeping more than a full day. "I told you it would be fine. You just have to play the knight when we are out in public." Robert relaxed, his rigid posture softening, though a glimmer of relief remained carefully masked in his expression. He nodded to Arthur, acknowledging the lord's openness. Lucille, catching Roland's reassuring glance, also visibly relaxed. "Thank you, Sir Arthur. We appreciate your discretion in this matter and your hospitality. We know it's unconventional, given the circumstances," Lucille said, her voice steady with gratitude. Arthur waved a hand dismissively while leaning back in his chair, finding the encounter a bit jarring as he was not really used to being thanked by other nobles. "Think nothing of it. I'm honored to offer what support I can, and you are both welcome here. From what I've heard, you'll fit right in with my merry band of miscreants." That being said, he glanced towards Mary, who had been standing patiently by his side. "Mary, would you give our guests a tour of the estate? Show them the grounds, perhaps the gardens. Gareth or Morian might be able to show Sir Robert around the barracks and training grounds, and perhaps Lady Lucille would enjoy visiting our runesmithy. She might also want to familiarize herself with Master Brolvia, our resident Master Runesmith." "A Master Runesmith? I would love to." His future sister-in-law was still the rune enthusiast she had always been. Although she had attended the institute and participated in extensive runic research, she hadn't worked in the field with practical runesmithing. It was clear that she longed to visit real-world locations where true runic craftsmanship took place, rather than the sterile environments of the Institute. Excellent! Arthur said, nodding as Mary inclined her head with a soft smile, gesturing for Robert and Lucille to follow her. This way, Sir Robert, Lady Lucille. I'll show you around. Remember, while you're outside in public, don't use your real names. Before they left, Roland stopped them to issue a reminder. Their old names had to be discarded and never spoken in public. The only reason they could use them here was thanks to his runic monitoring system, which kept anyone from overhearing. May I know how I should refer to them? Mary asked before entering the room as she had been left out in the dark. Roland nodded and soon after responded. We have decided to go with Durandal for Robert and Cortana for Lucille. I have already arranged new statuses for both of them, we just need to finalize their new identities at the guild. After Robert and Lucille left with Mary, Roland and Arthur remained in the office, the faint sounds of their footsteps fading down the hallway. Arthur's posture shifted subtly, signaling his readiness to discuss matters of strategy and future plans with Roland. With a soft sigh, he steepled his fingers and regarded Roland with a thoughtful expression. Well then. I suppose we should discuss the future of Albrook and our mutual interests. My brothers have been, quiet, unusually so. Yet they still send spies into Albrook, nothing overt, but enough to be a nuisance. I wouldn't need much to justify taking action if I wanted, but I'm not sure we are ready yet. Roland nodded. He had access to Albrook's monitoring system and knew the spy problem was ongoing. After many spies had been captured, they switched tactics, contacting the Thieves' Guild instead. The guild leader, who was secretly working with Roland's side, was feeding the spies false information. How long they would be fooled was uncertain, but for now, they were too afraid to cause trouble in the city. Their only options were questioning residents or attempting bribes. It's too soon for a direct confrontation, but with time, we might be able to stand on equal ground with your brothers. You've mentioned that, but I'm not sure if I fully believe you. While Albrook has been growing, my dear brothers have had quite a head start over me. Roland nodded as he listened. Though he and Arthur had discussed various matters before, they had never seriously considered going on the offensive, it had always seemed unrealistic. But after Roland achieved Tier 3 status and helped Arthur's most trusted guards level up, things began to shift. They even managed to scare off Theodore Valerian's forces as he fled from his failed teleportation attempt. Aldbourne was nearby and, with time, could become their new territory, if Arthur even had such ambitions. Their partnership had begun as a simple exchange of mutual assistance, and neither had initially imagined expanding beyond this one city. But now, their strength was growing at an impressive pace. They needed to decide on a direction, and for that, Roland had to understand Arthur's ultimate goal. We can probably catch up in time, but first, tell me, do you even want that? Is there a reason for us to fight? We could consider joining one of your brothers. If not Theodore, then perhaps Julius. Roland posed the question thoughtfully. After all, he had already achieved most of what he wanted. Arthur becoming the next Valerian Duke would be a great outcome, but it wasn't essential to Roland's plans. As an established runic craftsman, Roland could likely join any faction he chose. Arthur, however, still had a choice. He could continue building his forces and pursue his legacy as the rightful heir. But was that truly his goal? Was there a reason to push further? That's a good question. Arthur pondered for a while and rose from his seat to move over towards the window. There he could see some soldiers training, sweat falling down their foreheads as they desperately attempted to get stronger. You know, before I came here, I had almost given up all hope. Arthur paused, gazing out the window and looking further out into the city before continuing. Even after I took control of Albrook, there was a part of me that didn't truly believe any of this would work. I wanted to convince myself otherwise, telling myself that all of this effort, all the planning and alliances, would lead somewhere. But deep down, I was persuading myself, I suppose, into believing there was a chance. Roland listened intently, arms crossed, his expression softened. While he was a man of a few words, it didn't mean that he had no emotions. Arthur was opening up himself to him so he could at least listen. I never thought I'd see even a glimpse of success. The world doesn't favor people like me, Roland. Bastards, pretenders. My brothers, they were the rightful heirs. Even if they had treated me as a family member, there would have been no place for me. Arthur's voice hardened, his fingers drumming against the window ledge. And yet here we are. The city's growing, the people are with us, and for the first time, I feel like I might actually have something worth fighting for. He turned to Roland, a glint of steely resolve in his gaze. When you showed up, I don't know, somehow things started going right. You helped everyone grow, strengthened the defenses, and taught us things we never would have learned on our own. I think I've become greedier because of it. I want this, Roland. I want to push forward, to see if I can win it all. To prove to them once and for all, that I was not just a bastard. Arthur paused for a moment before looking into Roland's eyes. The two had discussed their pasts before but never really their future goals. But what about you? I might be a greedy bastard, but if you wish to retreat, I'll understand. Roland wondered for a moment as to how to answer this question, and for some reason, he felt chatty today. To be honest, I never wanted it to come this far. I thought that if I found a deep enough hole, no one would bother me. So I came here, to Albrook, a little town in the middle of nowhere, with nothing interesting in it. It seemed like the perfect place to fade away into obscurity. He gave out a sigh while shrugging as he recalled the various events that led up to this moment. Something always seemed to go wrong, as if the more I tried to retreat, the more the world found ways to pull me back in. He paused for a moment to gather his thoughts, eyes darting around to find something to look at as he summarized his thoughts. But then, things changed. It was when I started working with people, with you and the others here in Albrook. I realized that, as much as I wanted to keep the world at arm's length, there's worth in being part of something. I tried to stay detached, but now I can't imagine a world without them. However, I also understand that power is paramount in this world, and without it, all that I created could be taken away in an instant. Arthur nodded, understanding where Roland was coming from. I suppose that's why I decided to keep going, to keep growing, and I still need to continue. With you, Arthur, I probably have the best shot at it. That's probably the gist of it. Arthur chuckled at Roland's final words, which implied that he was being used for his position. He didn't mind though, as both of them had a mutual understanding of their positions and now goals. Then how about we move forward together as we did before? Doesn't sound like a bad idea to me. Then, let our bastard union continue, until we achieve our goals together. The two nodded at each other and soon after shook hands, sealing their pact with a silent understanding. Their journey, though fraught with challenges and unexpected twists, had forged a bond between them that was more than mere convenience. It was a shared ambition, one that had grown from mere survival into something far greater.